Hi there. We are going to start with Chapter 1 in this brief overview of the key concepts related to decision-making, problem-solving, and critical thinking. The purpose of Chapter 1 is to help you think through the value of methodically approaching decision-making as it relates to leadership decisions within a hospital organization. What the takeaway from this chapter really should be: what are the possible methods that I can use to analyze information that's coming to me and make a good, well-rounded, analytical decision that benefits my organization, my team, my staff, and my unit? So often decisions are made off the cuff impulsively without really thinking through all available options and being methodical so that all points of view are considered and the best information is gathered. So we're going to go through this chapter to give you a general idea of how you approach decision making from a leadership perspective and what the benefits are of that. This is the schematic of what your book is using to guide its development. Marquise and Houston's critical thinking teaching model believes that when you approach leadership and management, that we can use didactic, which is basically the lecture component of the material, the group process, which is your engagement as a group of students, problem solving, which will be encompassed through case studies and classroom discussion, and then personalized learning, which will be how the material that we go through in this chapter is crafted and tweaked and adjusted to meet your personal needs. This is just an overview of the textbook's approach to how this course is laid out. Each chapter, my goal is that we touch on all four of these perspectives so that you have a good overall review of the content that we're covering and get the best opportunity to learn the material. When we think about decision making, I want you to think about decision making in these perspectives. Decision making being a complex cognitive process. You're trying to choose a particular course of action, and the thought process of selecting is a logical one, choosing from available options. Problem solving is defined as part of a decision-making systematic process focusing on analyzing a different situation, and then critical thinking or reflective thinking is the mental process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, analyzing, answering, synthesizing, and evaluating information to reach an answer or a conclusion. I want you to be able to understand those individual definitions and be able to determine which method you're using in approaching information. There's lots and lots of overlap here. The point in this slide is to make sure that you're aware that these three things, decision making, problem solving, and critical thinking, all go hand in hand. When we think about the characteristics of a critical thinker, someone that is using critical thinking, we believe that that individual uses insight and intuition and empathy, and they're willing to take an action when necessary. The reason critical thinking is so important in our clinical practice is because of the pace and the movement of things going on in our practice on a regular basis. We are needing to have an understanding of the complexity of our profession. We have only so much time to really synthesize all the information that's coming to us. Often the information that is coming to us from a practice standpoint is fluid, and it comes and it changes and it moves very quickly. Think about how information technology in healthcare has evolved and how each time we do an update or we review our informatics that are part of our practice, how much they change in just the matter of a year. This is the reason that we really need to be willing to use good decision-making and problem-solving skills and apply critical thinking so that we can reason things out and come up with our best solution. If we rely on intuition alone, if we're winging it, if we're impulsive, we're likely to not make our best decisions. This is another explanation of clinical reasoning, and I'm going to let you read that. I do want you to understand how important clinical reasoning is and how it impacts our practice. Vicarious learning is fantastic, and it's basically our way of saying it's experiential learning. We learn vicariously through our experiences. In our class, we're going to be using case studies as a way to explore new information and apply learning. You're going to be learning as we go through those case studies. Simulation is another example of vicarious learning in how we apply that in a simulation setting. As you're going through each of the scenarios in a simulation lab, you are learning through those experiences. I want to remind you that sometimes the learning you're having isn't just content. Sometimes it's teamwork or conflict resolution or communication skills. Sometimes in a simulation that leads to vicarious learning, the vicarious learning is, I won't do that again, or oops, should have thought that one through, or man, what were they thinking? So vicariously learning ideally is going to have a good underpinning of academic value, but the reality is we learn vicariously through all the interactions we experience during our day. Another way we can look at decision making is the method we use to make our best decisions. When we use the decision-making process of satisficing, basically what we're doing is we're trying to find a practical and agreeable solution that one person would suggest. When you're satisficing, not everyone is going to agree. It's just an option. Hey, would you guys go along with this? We really want to use optimal mode decision making, which gives us the opportunity to find the best solution. And how we find the best solution is by a negotiation and a common sharing of ideas and collaborating to get the most options on the table and to use critical thinking and problem solving to identify a decision that best meets or addresses the problem at hand. When we think about characteristics of successful decision makers, this is a great list. They're self-aware, they're courageous, they can be sensitive to others, and they're energetic, and they're often very creative. They're willing to look outside the box. Successful decision makers understand the influence of individual gender, personal individual values, life experiences, preferences, willingness to take risk, brain hemisphere and dominance, and the dominant thinking style. So when you are making decisions, not only first are you self-aware of what your own worldview is, your own experiences are, and how they influence your decision, but you're also sensitized to the people on your team who are involved in the decision-making process in a respectful way that understands that they bring their unique life experiences and perspectives when they're helping make a decision, and they're respectful of that. I want you to really think about and spend some time self-reflecting about what you bring to the table as a decision maker and how that benefits your team or maybe inhibits them. When we think about our brain hemisphere and the dominance and thinking styles, I want you to be first self-aware. What is your go-to thinking style? I'm going to argue, and there's evidence to support this, that we all use each 4 of these thinking styles at varying degrees of success at varying times. But under duress, under stressful conditions, under conflict, we all have our go-to style. I tend to be a lower right-brained thinker. If I'm overwhelmed, my go-to is to become emotional, to be overly sympathetic or empathetic with my audience, to trust my intuition. So that tends to make me not as critical thinking as I need to be, and I know that about myself. So when I'm dealing with conflict or stressful situations, I have to spend some time really slowing down my emotional response to things so that I can be a better version of myself, so that I can be more highly organized, more balanced in my approach, more analytical when it's necessary, instead of making impulsive decisions. I want you to think about what's your go-to style and how does that influence your interactions with others. This is Jeannie Robertson, and she's a comedian. There's a clip here that I'm going to spend some time showing you. I want you to pay attention to how the exemplar in her case is influenced when they least expect it by their thinking style and their brain dominance.
In our area of the country, as you know, when someone we know gets sick or has passed, That's the way we do it. Have you noticed it? If we hear the word past, and then we go on. I was seated next to a woman on the airplane not a month or two ago. She was 70 and going to see her sister. I'd never met her. And I said to her, how many siblings do you have? She said, I have 2 sisters, and then we had a third one. She passed in 1941. And both of us went, oh, I'm so sorry. You know what I think it is? I think it's just a little show of respect, just to stop for a minute and do like this and do this. Well, in our area of the country, when somebody gets sick that we know or has passed, we take over food. Have you noticed it? We take over food. You can buy that food. You can go to the deli in the grocery store, get something great, hire somebody to bake it, but put it down in the big list of important things for life. You get a lot more credit if you make it yourself. You can put it on your grandmother's platter, but the women in the kitchen will say, I know where she got that chicken. I'm telling you, it works out that way. And I make only one thing, and that is small little 7-Up pound cakes. I make them by the dozen. I'm out of town, something happens, left brain takes it over. And not long ago, got up one morning and heard that a friend of ours was sick and went to my freezer and the pound cakes were depleted. I did not realize I was out. He said, I've been taking them to a lot of people been sick. I said, well, I didn't know they were gone. I got to get a pound cake made before I leave town. Honey, go to the grocery store and get my ingredients. He said, I'm trying to get to badminton. I said, well, it's just a few ingredients. He said, I tell you what, I can get there and get it and still get to badminton, but you make sure I can go through that express lane. No problem. We don't go to the grocery store together anymore because I frankly don't care what things cost by the half ounce. So I made up the list and he left. Well, y'all, I waited. He didn't come back. I thought, he's gone on to badminton. And I thought, no, where could he be? I was getting ready to call the grocery store and I heard the car pull in. He came huffing up the steps, had 2 sacks and more sacks hanging on his arms. He just glared at me, started putting stuff down, and said, I'll get some more out of the car. I looked in the first sack, there was a pound of margarine and 2 gigantic bottles of vanilla flavor. Doling out a half teaspoon at a time, it would take forever to get rid of these 2 gigantic bottles of vanilla flavor. And in the next sack were 3 dozen eggs. I said, they had a special. I'll tell you, they had had a special. I didn't need but 5 eggs, and I just said a dozen. In the next sack was a big old thing of shortening, 2 of them. And in the next sack, 2 more, 12 pounds of lard. We could fry fish for everybody in here. But in that 4th sack, I found my list. And I'd like to step out of the kitchen just a minute to tell you something. Left Brain is a smart man. He went to Duke University on a basketball scholarship, played basketball for 4 years, and graduated in the same 4 years. Then he went to Carolina and got a master's degree and a doctorate. He has over-degreed himself. But I don't care how many pieces of paper you frame and put on the wall, if you have a left brain, it's going to kick in on you. And it kicked in on him about the 3rd aisle of that grocery store. I'll step back in the kitchen. I found my list, and in my eagerness to make sure that he could get through the express lane, for probably the first time in my life, I numbered the items. Number 1, a pound of butter, no problem. Number 2, large bottle of vanilla flavor, and I had 2 of them. Number 3, a dozen eggs. This man has a doctorate degree. Number 4, a big tub thing of lard. I could hear him coming back. I looked down at number 5. Said a 5-pound bag of sugar. I knew he was coming in with 25 pounds of sugar. And number 6 was a 5-pound bag of all-purpose flour, 30 pounds of flour. Now, I believe in accepting things you can't change, but I also believe in hounding things sometimes, and then sometimes I let it ride. And this time, y'all would have been proud of me. I let it ride. I put that list behind my back. He came in again, plopping down sugar and flour all over, bam, 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 gets it all down there and says, 1 more trip. I went back to my list and looked, and number 7 was a bottle of 7-Up. I don't want that big bottle because if you're going to make 1 cake and you just use it, it'll be stale by the time I get back. I told him I wanted a 6-pack of those medium-sized ones hanging. So I knew he was coming back in with 42 bottles of 7-Up. And in a minute, there he was. I had just cleared a space for him right here, back it up. Put them all down and turned around to me before he left and said, well, obviously, they wouldn't let me through the express lane. But you know what? He got all the way out in the hall and came back and he said, for the record, I figured out what I had done. But by then she was ringing up the 7-Up. And all these people behind me in line were laughing. And I got to get to badminton. Don't tell anybody. I said, I won't. 3 days later, I went to the grocery store, and a woman that was checking me out says, I think I checked out your husband a few days ago. I said, I'm sure you could have. She said, that was an interesting order. I said, let me explain to you. And she was from this area too, and this proves it, because I said, anytime a friend of ours gets sick or has passed, and both of us went, said, I make the pound cakes, we take it over. This woman said to me, is there an epidemic?
Okay, now you are probably sitting there completely puzzled as to why I made you watch that 7-minute video. Or you're still laughing. I included it because I think it's funny. I love Jeannie Roberts' perspective.
I've told you 4 stories.
So let's take a few moments and talk about theoretical approaches to problem solving and decision making. I want you to be able to look at these 2 lists, traditional problem solving and managerial decision making. I want you to understand that they are different in several ways, but one specific way. First, the traditional problem solving process is focused on a problem. What's the problem and how do I fix it? A good managerial decision making model focuses on a goal. What do I want the outcome to be when I'm done with this process, with this intervention, with this implementation? So one has more of a negative connotation of I'm fixing a problem versus a managerial decision, which is I'm addressing a solution. I'm looking for an outcome. Both themes have clear objectives. They gather data carefully. They take the necessary time. Ideally, both methods use an evidence-based approach. They give lots of alternatives. There's logical thinking involved, and they choose and act decisively. All of those are important. The quality of the decision from either of these processes is directly impacted by the time spent asking questions and generating alternatives. And this is done best in an environment where multiple people are involved in the decision-making process. One of the models that we use is the nursing process. And interestingly, because nurses are very, very good at the nursing process, it's our practice, it's the thing that makes us such good nurse leaders, because we know how important it is to assess our patients, just like we would assess a problem on the unit, how we would diagnose our patient's problems, just like we would diagnose a problem within our team, to make a plan to care for our patient, just like we would plan an intervention for our team or an organizational issue. And then we'd implement it. We'd implement the care we planned for our patient, or we'd implement a plan of intervention to support an organizational goal. And in both ways, whether patient care or organization, we're going to evaluate the outcome. How did my patient respond to this? How did my environment, my department, my unit respond to the decisions I made? The understanding of the nursing process and our adherence to it in a methodical way, again, makes us really good nurse leaders. The integrated ethical solution model is right here. I think it's pretty straightforward. What's important to take is to understand that effective thinking and problem solving in this process, that again, it's methodical and it requires time. All of these methods require time, but this one especially is pretty time consuming. The recognition prime decision model is interestingly one that is frequently used by nurse leaders and can be used by nurse leaders who are seasoned, experienced professionals. The RPD model is when decisions are made by gut instinct. It requires expertise and enough experience to recognize patterns when they represent themselves in an environment. Because you've had enough experience and you've seen patterns that become predictable, you're able to discern the best likely options when you're trying to intervene on this. Sorry, my slide slipped. So, some examples of people that use the RPD model: police officers, military, seasoned ICU nurses. All of these organizations really rely on using the RPD model based on time constraints and the acuity of a situation. One of the best movies I've seen in a while was the 2016 movie Sully. It starred Tom Hanks, and it explored the experience of Captain Sully, who landed the plane in the Hudson River when they had they flew in to a flock of, I think it was geese, and they lost both of their engines. And in the end of the movie, spoiler alert, he's on the stand defending why he didn't choose to follow the radio tower's suggestion to land the plane at a nearby airport. And he kept saying, I knew from my experience, I knew from all the times I have flown this plane in real time that I was not going to be able to make it. Well, they kept using computer-generated models saying, you had enough time, you had enough fuel, what's the issue? And he reminded them that they were using a clinical sterile environment for their computer models, that they hadn't factored in human stress. They hadn't factored in the delay time of real life decision making, not a computer generated decision. And when the people that were exploring the case against Captain Sully added reasonable delays for critical thinking and response to stress, they found that had he not landed the plane on the Hudson, had he followed the radio tower's suggestion to land the plane or attempt to land the plane at the other airport, he would have crashed into a civilian area and never made it to the landing strip, because the reality was he had flown enough, he knew enough about his plane, and he was an expert. He had enough information to know the right decision without using as in-depth, as detailed decision-making modeling like what we would use in the nursing process in the slide before. I think that was a great example of really giving us a good example of the RPD modeling use. Decision-making in an organization. It's so important that we remember that powerful people in organizations are more likely to have decisions made either by themselves or their subordinates that are congruent with their own preferences and values. Power matters. So whoever's at the top of the food chain is going to use their own experiences and their own desires to influence decision making. I want you to be able to discern the difference between the economic man and the administrative man decision making. An economic man decision making process would be rational and complete, have a complete knowledge of the problem, a complete list and ordered preferences of alternatives, decisions are maximized, and really in-depth discovery. And this, if you were going to pick a model that lined up with the economic man, the nursing model would be a pretty good lineup as far as models go. Administrative man decides, makes decisions that are good enough. Knowledge is sometimes fragmented. It may not be possible to predict all the alternative solutions, and they choose from fewer options. The final choice is satisfying, but not maximizing. So their goal is good enough, not a detailed analysis of the issue and coming up with the best option. Administrative man is going to be more of a right brain thinker and tend to be more in line with the RPD model, which is instinctual. So, going back again, the economic man, more of a left brain thinker, would most likely use a traditional model. So I want you to be able to discern the difference between those and the benefits of both. I don't want you to think this is good or bad. Both of these processes or approaches to decision making have value. We're going to go through these types of decision-making tools pretty briefly. I just want you to be able to discern the difference in general. I want to remind you that decision-making models, consequence tables, all the tools we have that help us make decisions do not prevent us from making the wrong decision. They're just tools, folks. They're going to help us gather as much data to analyze the information the best we can and then make a decision that is the best possible one with the information we have at hand. Doesn't mean it's going to be a perfect decision. It just means we're trying to mitigate the imperfect decisions. This is a consequence table. It's going to demonstrate how various alternatives are created under different consequences. Often a consequence table is going to answer the question, if I do this, this will happen. Examples of consequence tables, there's decision grids, there's payoff tables, and then there's decision trees. All three of those help you determine if I do this, then this will happen. And this is an example of a consequence table. This is a decision grid, and a decision grid is a visual example of alternatives. It compares one thing against the same criteria. Payoff tables are great for quantitative data. Think about numbers. If I want to look at something that is analyzing groups of numbers, a payoff table is one of the best ones to use. And then we have a decision tree. Decisions are tied to the outcome of other events. So if this happens, you do this. If this doesn't happen, you do this. And this is an example of a decision tree. I want to help you kind of think about a decision tree as plots of decisions that are time visualized over the outcome. So what that means is that the decision is plotted over time, kind of in a progressive manner. So in this example, did the employees experience an injury or illness? Yes or no. And then you go to the next box, yes or no. So it's a progression of decision making that leads you to a final outcome. The logic model, these are schematics or pictures of how programs are intended to operate. They show relationship between resources, processes, and desired outcome. So this is a great example of giving you that. Think about relationships when you're thinking about a logic model, the connections of things that are occurring organizationally and how they come. Very often there's directional arrows and there's a process that's in place, but it's more based on relationships, whereas decision-making models are more based on outcomes. This is the program evaluation and review technique. This is a flowchart depicting when events and activities must take place if a final event is to occur. When you think about the PERT technique, think timing. How do I get everything done to have this happen at this time? There's some precision involved in this. A good example of when this technique would be used is if you are in charge of an emergency room and you are required to analyze the throughput of the patient from the time they arrive in the ER to the time they've been dispositioned either home or admission. So this is a tool that would be used to figure out how do patients navigate through the ER, through each of our embedded systems, and get to the end of the line. And they're really most often looking at progression in a time continuum. Questions to ask about data gathering. I'm going to let you read these. These are basic logistics questions. Then these are questions that are asking about analyzing a solution. The purpose in asking these questions is to look at data from every vantage point possible. So the previous slide was getting as much data as possible, collecting as much thorough information as possible. And then this slide is helping you kind of navigate, how do I take that information and analytically look at it so that I can make the best decision? These are strategies for new nurses to promote evidence-based practice. And I'm going to let you read through this. I'm not going to read them to you. So important that you really understand that good decision-making is methodical, it is thoughtful, and it is based on evidence. Those steps will help you make the best outcome for your organization.